So you will see that it is being recorded. In order to, oh, I'm so sorry. Please ignore point 3. We don't have closed captioning for this webinar, unfortunately, but we hope to provide in the future. In terms of CEUs, we do not offer CEUs for this webinar, but you can receive a certificate of attendance. We will email the link to recording, and in that email, you will also see a link about how you can receive a certificate of attendance for this webinar. Um, we're also gonna really advise everyone, because we have so many persons here, please use the Q&A box for any questions for our speakers. You can also feel free to call out where you're coming from, or where you are tuning in from rather. In the chat box, I'm seeing a lot of persons in the US. We're interested in knowing, where you're all coming in from. Go ahead. Okay, great. So for this webinar, in the registration email that you would have gotten, you were encouraged to take this Advanced Childhood Experiences quiz. I'm going to drop the link to the quiz in the chat box. And if you have not taken the quiz, we do advise that you take it now, because it is going to play an important part in this discussion that we're going to be having.
So I'm going to lead off the introductions today. My name is Guyton Colantuano. I'm the Executive Director of Project Return Peer Support Network. We're a peer-run agency in Los Angeles County. I'm super excited to be here with the collaborators, Kat and Nia. I've been working with them for the better part of a year or so, and I really think that, and I hope today that people get a very fresh perspective on trauma-informed care. It's a, it's a training. It's a term that we've been using here in mental health for quite some time, and I think that Kat and Nia is going to add a very amazing and beautiful perspective to today. So I turn it over to Kat to introduce yourself, and then Nia, please.
Sure. So I can introduce myself. I am Kat McIntosh. I am the manager of Global Peer Support at Mental Health America. I started last September, which means I'm still fairly new. And I also identify as a peer. I live with bipolar disorder, complex PTSD, as well as social anxiety. So if I'm fumbling over myself, hope you can have some compassion for me as we go through this. I also use she, their pronouns, so feel free to refer to me as either one. It's not a problem. And yeah, I'm really passionate about this particular subject matter when it comes to trauma-informed care. Someone who's experienced a lot of early childhood trauma and is still dealing with the effects of that in their life. Yeah, Nia, you can go ahead.
Hello, good morning to some, good afternoon to others. My name is Nia Lancelin Brantley, and I'm the training specialist for Project Return Peer Support Network. I am also fairly new. I just moved into this position about 2 months ago. I previously worked on the Warm Line, where we offer support to callers on a daily basis. So I also come as a peer. I have bipolar disorder 1, severe panic disorder, and anxiety. So
services. And so, yeah, again, welcome. I'm going to go to the next slide and let's have some fun. So I don't know why that slide doesn't want to stay there. I'm having technical difficulty. It keeps moving. So I'm going to do this real quick because the slide keeps moving. So the learning objectives for today is to understand trauma and the need for trauma-informed care. It's also to highlight unintentional situations where organizations can cause harm. And I think for me, this is a critical lens in trauma-informed care. It's not just attending a training, but it's considering how we organize around the concept of trauma-informed care. And then showcase methods organizations can use to implement trauma-informed care. And again, I think that's a key feature of what we hope to express today. So now let me go back to this. And there we go. What is trauma? It describes experiences or situations that are emotionally painful and distressing. It overwhelms someone's ability to cope, and it can create feelings of powerlessness. And that's according to the Center for Nonviolence and Social Justice at Drexel University.
So what do the statistics say? So as you see, research shows that an average of 47% of people experience physical abuse, 37% sexual abuse, 30% post-traumatic stress disorder, as we know as PTSD. Studies also showcase that 60% of adults reporting experiencing abuse or other difficult family circumstances during childhood. Again, that is something that we will definitely discuss later on in this conversation. Results from a study on outpatients showed that the two most reported traumatic types were emotional abuse at 59% and physical neglect at 54%.
So when we're talking about the effects of trauma, these are some three main points we want to really pay attention to, which is one, trauma can have immediate and delayed reactions. So let's say, for instance, childhood trauma. Immediate reactions can be intense anger or tantrums and those kinds of stuff. But delayed reactions can be a person's inability to form social relationships, you know. So when we think about trauma, so many times we think about the immediate effects, but we don't think about the long-term delayed reactions that may arise because of trauma. Um, Another point to make and to remember about trauma is that we may not all be aware of our trauma or the effects on us. So a lot of times we can experience trauma and we don't necessarily know that it is trauma when we're experiencing it. It's only like 5 years or 10 years from now, we're like, oh, like this, what happened to me wasn't okay. Um, and when it comes to the effects, we may not necessarily be able to pinpoint that this anger that I'm experiencing or this depression that I'm experiencing is a result of this specific trauma. It can just be I'm feeling angry, but it's only upon self-reflection or peer support or therapy then we're realizing, oh, these are the effects that I'm still experiencing because of this trauma that happened so many times or so many years ago rather. Um, and thirdly, the effects of trauma really impacts the whole person. So we're talking about the physical impacts. We're talking about emotional, cognitive, behavioral, even existential. Like, where do I fit in into the universe if all these things happen to me? You know, do I even want to be here in this space? So there is this multi-layering effect that is happening upon a person when we're thinking about trauma. So, in talking about the effects of trauma, I'm just going to highlight three of the components, which is the physical, emotional, and cognitive. So, when we're talking about physical, such things that happens is trauma can actually affect our immune system. So, our body's ability to fight off diseases and fight off physical things and physical sicknesses that can happen. Um, may not develop normally because of the trauma experience that we have had. Similarly, our stress response, so our body's ability to be resilient against stress. We talk a lot about resiliency, but resiliency looks different from person to person based off of the impact of trauma on the body. Physical effects of trauma also include their sensitivity to light, sound, touch. For my own lived experience, I can definitely see this happening. Um, when I have those trauma symptoms happening within myself, I have extreme sensitivity to light, to extreme sensitivity to any kind of sound. And I think that's really important for us to remember when it comes to those delayed reactions that trauma can bring, that persons can still be experiencing those things, even though their trauma happened, 5, 10 years ago. Um, Physical effects of trauma also include things like chronic pain. So fibromyalgia being one where, the body almost like it stores up trauma within the body. And it can really have a lot of impacts when it comes to someone's ability to navigate their day to day because of this long term effect. Persons can also experience dissociation or disconnection as a result of trauma. So persons can report like feeling like they're in a fog, or feeling like their brain is feeling kind of hazy. They feel disconnected, almost like the real world doesn't feel like an actual reality. And these are some lingering effects that they can have. We also have emotional effects. So there was a study that was done that looked at child maltreatment and its effect on the brain. And it found that over 50% of persons who had experienced three or more forms of trauma developed things like major depressive disorder and also fit the criteria for PTSD. So that's really important when it comes to the emotional effects. Trauma can have this lingering effect on persons that we really need to bear in mind when we're speaking about working with persons in our organization. Um, Other emotional effects of trauma can include numbness, anger, denial, feeling vulnerable, feeling anxious. And remember, we have to link this back again to the delayed effects. So some of these things may be instant. So if someone experiences um, you know, a life-changing event, the instant reaction can be anger, denial, numbness, but also a delayed reaction can also be those things. So we really need to bear this in mind when engaging with persons and thinking about trauma. Um, we also have our cognitive effects. So we can have intrusive thoughts, so flashbacks of the events, flashbacks of those memories. Persons may have even difficulty concentrating and remembering. So trauma can even impact our brain's ability to focus, our brain's ability to remember thoughts, have those short-term memories that we you know often need to just engage in society. It can really impact someone's ability to do those things. It can also lead to disorientation, confusion. Persons can report like distortion in terms of time and space. We talked about that dissociation and disconnection feeling, that kind of foggy feeling. And that dissociation and disconnection can lead them to have large gaps of time that are almost unaccounted for. Um, and trauma can also affect the person's ability to make decision. So it can impact that freeze flight response within us, and bring about that confusion where they have a hard time just making what we think are simple decisions.
Kat, can I jump in just briefly? I'm looking at
Yes.
some of the questions, and we're going to be answering questions at the end.
Mm-hmm.
What I do want to remind the group is this front end of the presentation, we're going over common information that you can find about trauma. Neither of us are clinicians, so some questions related to like diagnostic criteria are not items within our scope of practice. What we hope to emphasize today is what organizations can consider about responding to trauma.
So now we're going to do a poll. What are the events that cause trauma? So at this time, I believe Kat you're going to see a poll pop up, and we are going to have about 30 to 45 seconds to fill out that poll, and then we'll see the results. So that should pop up on your screen very soon.
Yeah, so we are giving 30 to 45 seconds to complete this. Okay, great. So our poll has ended. I'm just going to share the results here. Nia, do you want to take it away?
Yeah, sure. So we have, as you see, the list has abuse at the top with 100%, bullying at 98%, death or injury, 98%, losing your home or community, 98%, incarceration, 98%, life shift, 86%, and intergenerational trauma, 97%. So let's go ahead and hop into the next slide and talk about these things a little further. So as we see on this slide, basically everything that we mentioned in the poll is in some way, in some form, considered a trauma. So let's talk about this a little further. So with violence, everyone knows of domestic violence, but there is also the term that I appreciate a little more, intimate partner violence, where we are intimately engaged with someone, but there is violence in that space, in the home, and whatever it may be. So domestic violence, according to the CDC, 1 in 4 women and 1 in 7 men will experience physical violence by their intimate partner at some point during their lifetime. About 1 in 3 women and nearly 1 in 6 men experience some form of sexual violence during their lifetime. So as you see, this is something that unfortunately is very common. So you find that, you may actually know someone who is experiencing that in their lives, in their personal lives. There is also emotional violence and psychological violence, even spiritual violence and cultural violence. So there are a lot of areas in which we can receive that type of behavior upon us. Abuse, rape and molestation, verbal abuse, emotional abuse, and even financial abuse. So financial abuse is when someone is restricting someone from actual ability to take care of themselves financially, maybe not being able to get a bank account or something of that nature is that financial abuse. So disaster, we're going to get a little more into a little later as well, but those natural disasters that displace families, where people lose homes, where jobs are being lost, and that array of things that come around those natural disasters. And one that we are just hopefully coming out of at this time, a pandemic. Okay, so That can be very traumatic. And as we saw in the past year, the mental health services, the need for mental health services has gone up exponentially. So that is also something that we will be talking about later. So loss, death, job loss, a divorce, loss of a relationship, that can all send a person into the stages of grief, which I'm sure we know well. Going into that shock and denial, or that pain and guilt, anger, depression, going upward, that upward turn, reconstruction and working through it, acceptance and hope. So we go into that stage of grief when we lose someone, and all of those steps can actually be traumatic in some form. Even going into intergenerational trauma. So, personally, I've heard stories of, a friend or something may have experienced a trauma in their younger days, maybe a rape or a molestation. And they find through sharing that story that their mother had the same experience. And as the mother is sharing that story, maybe the grandmother has that same experience. So we find that there are certain things that kind of travel through the generations. Also considering smoking, how that travels, health conditions, obesity. The list can go on and on when we get to that intergenerational trauma and how that affects us mentally and physically. And also life shifts. So life shifts can be very traumatic, although sometimes they may seem positive, but moving, marriage or even divorce, the birth of the child, using the definition that trauma can overwhelm a person is anything that overwhelms a person at any point in time, that does mean that we can actually experience positive trauma. So what is positive trauma? So positive trauma, an example of that would be winning the lottery. Okay, everyone thinks they want to win the lottery, but that may actually cause some PTSD. It can affect the self-system and changes that it brings. So having an abundance of resources can be positive, but it can also be overwhelming to the winner, and the winner may not be able to cope. So that life shift that even may seem positive may bring forth a little trauma. Okay, so we are going to now bring up the poll again. Okay, and I believe Kat is running that for us again. And so let's just see what the poll says.
So for this poll, we're asking, can trauma affect people differently? Again, you'll have 30 seconds. And yeah, you're just clicking on one of the responses there. Awesome. You want to go ahead and discuss the results?
Yeah. All right. Thank you, everyone. So as we know, trauma can affect everyone differently. And I think that's something that we have to keep in the forefront of our minds when we are offering services to mental health consumers, that everyone is coming into the space being affected differently by what they have experienced. Oftentimes we get into a mode of, I taught for 20 years. So you kind of get into a mode of teaching in the same way, but in order to get the results that you need, you have to, be more personalized in the services that you are giving. So we can't get in that monotonous way of giving services. We have to tailor fit to the person that is in need. So what are some experiences of trauma? People can be exposed to the same trauma and react very differently. The forms of trauma we just discussed and many others can cause PTSD. So many people exposed to this, trauma can affect people emotionally, socially, and physically. And this is something that I actually often say, is that you cannot go through your life without some form of trauma. Trauma-informed care is needed because both members and service providers experience trauma. They also continuously interact with one another, and there is potential for conflict. So that is a really big point that I like to bring forth, and really discuss, in that everyone experiences some form of trauma in their life. So that's when I want to talk about the ACEs and bring that in. So the ACEs is, as I'm sure some of us know, the adverse childhood experiences. So this was a study that I believe actually was started in the 1970s, but it was kind of made popular by Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris, which is actually our first Surgeon General here in California. So this test basically brings forth the question, what happened to you, and not what's wrong with you, okay? So that's kind of the paradigm shift. And we're really focusing on what is happening, what happened, what are you affected by, not as opposed to what's wrong. That's really a closed-in question that we can't get too far with. So the ACEs study, I'm not sure if everyone had a chance to do that. So I'm just going to pause maybe for a minute. The ACEs test, if you have not already taken it, is only 10 questions. So we'll just pause for a few seconds. And if you haven't gotten a chance to, go ahead and take a second to take that test. So I'll just give it about 30 seconds. So in talking about the ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, there is 67% of people, of adults, who have at least one ACE, okay? So that is a pretty, that's over half, okay? So we're working with a pretty large amount of people who have experienced at least one form of trauma before their 18th birthday, and this is in the household, okay? So that is our 67%, and 12.6%, which is 1 in 8, have experienced at least 4 or more, okay? So as we see, as the numbers go up, there's more risk of health and social problems. And as your ACE score increases, so does the risk of disease, social, and emotional problems. So that is something that we have to be mindful of in giving services. What trauma am I working from? What am I working through? And am I placing this trauma on the person that I'm giving services to? So I think that's something to be really mindful of in dealing with your trauma as well as someone else's trauma. So other experiences of trauma, car accident or injury, that can bring mood swings. We're jumping, it's jumping again. So mood swings ranging from anger to frustration to guilt, a high level of stress and anxiety, nightmares and disrupted sleep patterns such as insomnia, new fears or phobias that are developed, and emotional trauma. So with natural disasters, the pandemic, there is actually the post-COVID disorder that people are experiencing, where there is a lot of anxiety, or they were feeling alone and isolated, or that prolonged trauma where you are in that feeling of that traumatic experience for months or years or whatever that may be. So adults with anxiety or depression in January 2019 were 11%. And as we see after the pandemic, adults with depression or anxiety in January 2021, we were at 41%. Okay, so we can go on to the next slide. Oh, I think we went backwards.
Yeah. I think we're going backward right now.
All right,
Okay,
there we
awesome.
are.
So we're talking about what does trauma-informed care mean? You know, it's a wonderful term that is used a lot, but what does it really mean? Um, so in its most, I would say, complicated form is this definition from SAMHSA, which I really love. So it talks about a program, organization, or system that is trauma-informed realizes the widespread impact of trauma and understands potential paths for recovery. It also recognizes the signs and symptoms of trauma in clients, families, staff, and others involved with the system, and responds by fully integrating knowledge about trauma into policies, procedures, and practices, and seeks to actively resist re-traumatization. It's a very long definition, but I think it's a very worthwhile and informed definition. So you see the multi-layers of it, right? It's about recognizing. So you recognize the signs, you recognize the symptoms, and not just within your clients or within your members, but also within your own lives, within your own families, within the persons that you interact with your team, or anybody else, your community. It's really about just keeping at your forefront, as Nia pointed out, not what's wrong with you, but what happened to you, and keeping that question at your forefront when you engage with persons. But then moving past that, once you have recognized the signs, it's also about responding to those signs. And how do you respond is in terms of the integration, looking at your policies, looking at your procedures, looking at the practices within your organizations and saying, are we being sensitive enough in the way that we're engaging, where we're not engaging in a way that is re-traumatizing to the person that we engage with? So in this space, in our office, in our organization, are the things that we're doing reminding persons of the trauma that they've experienced? And if it is, then is it really trauma informed, and what can we do to address it? So in its most simplistic version, is this definition Nia and I love in terms of the deliberate act of it all. So it's a deliberate act to not exacerbate the trauma someone has while they are trying to receive services. So when someone is coming into your organization, when someone is engaging you, it should not be a process that I like to say activates that trauma within them, and makes that space feel unsafe for them, and therefore makes them not even want to engage with the service that you're offering. And for me, that is also a really important part, that when we don't implement trauma-informed care in the way that it should, what happens is that it can definitely impact persons want to even engage with our services. You know, it impacts those, we love to talk about stats, but it impacts those statistics. It impacts those statistics of what that feedback is like. How is our organization growing? And is our inability to implement trauma-informed care impacting those statistics that we're seeing? Yeah, we can go on to the next slide. Okay, great. So we're going to do another poll here. And this poll is, we're going to ask, do organizations reinforce trauma? So again, you have 30 seconds, and we want to see your responses here. Okay, great. So, Nia, do you want to take this or you want me?
You can go ahead and then I'll hop into the next slide.
Sure. So we're seeing head results from you all. 70% of you have indicated yes, organizations do reinforce trauma. 10% say no. And 19% of you are unsure about that. So that's really interesting to me. Um, Oh, sorry, I did not share the results. Okay, so I'm sharing the results now. Right. Yeah, so 70, 10, 90. And this is particularly interesting to me because we're gonna relaunch this poll later on in the presentation. And we want to see what are your responses after Nia and I have presented the rest of the presentation.
All right, so we are going to talk about a few do's and don'ts, and kind of what they mean when we present these things and when we present in this way. So first, I want to talk about physical structures. So we see you're welcoming, have up-to-date resources, like magazines and brochures. This may not seem like a big deal, but it lets the person know, like, hey, we want to give you current information. We want to make sure that the resources we are giving you, you can go to that email or you can go to that website and it will be current and it will be of service to you. So something that may seem that small can have a really big effect. Also having fresh plants, having things that actually have life, that are growing and that are being taken care of. We may walk into an agency and there are, fake plants that are dusty and not taken care of. So those little things like that can really take you a long way. I think when you present in that way, you're saying, hey, we care about you. Hey, we trust you with this space. We want you to be here. There is harmony here. We are going to make sure that you're comfortable so that we are providing the best services to you in the best way possible. So something that is a don't are having waiting rooms, having someone come in and wait 30 minutes, 45 minutes, even 15 minutes for someone with anxiety. That can be a very daunting wait. So having that access to that person when they arrive, being ready and available to be of service to them. Metal detectors can be really triggering. It shows a lack of trust. Okay, so we want to make sure that we are welcoming people into the space and we are saying, hey, we trust you. We want to work with you. We are here with you and for you. Also, going along with the metal detectors, the security guards. It kind of puts out there that, hey, this person is dangerous. As someone who lives with bipolar disorder, that is one of the biggest misconceptions, that we, bust into a room and we're throwing things all over the place. So being in a space where someone is already guarded and kind of expecting you to react in a certain way is almost triggering to bring you into that mental place. So that is just something to think about. And that is not to say that there are not certain scenarios where you do need the authorities, where you do need security and safety, but just being mindful that that these are the things that can be really triggering to a person who already has some form of trauma. So going into engaging with members. So we do want to realize the prevalence of trauma, how this affects a person's whole life, their daily existence, what they are walking through and what they are living through and what they are coming in with. So oftentimes we have to make sure that we're not taking things personally. And I think just as a human, that is hard to do. Although where you're training, you may understand not to take things personally. Just being a human, sometimes that can happen. So just realizing that someone is coming in with all of this trauma, all of these lived experiences, and they may be putting this on you. So you're just realizing the prevalence of that trauma and how it is affecting their entire being per se. Recognize signs. Know your consumers, know your clients, know your members, and recognize those signs of trauma. Are they, as Kat mentioned, are they sensitive to light or sound? Do they kind of have that fight or fright type behavior, or reactions to things? Are they forgetting things? Are they not able to make decisions? Recognizing those signs and realizing what the person is experiencing at that moment, and realizing that they are in the midst of remembering or reliving some form of trauma, and have a responsive system. How are you going to react to them? How are you going to apply what you know and really empower this person, as opposed to re-traumatizing them? So that is also something that Kat actually just mentioned. We want to make sure that we're not re-traumatizing the person by the things that we are doing as service providers. So that is something really important. The things that we are saying, even our body language, or certain gestures, or just things of that nature that we may, just as a natural person in our natural selves, do certain things. As you see, I talk with my hands, but this may be really traumatizing for someone who, may have gotten hit all the time as a child. So with me flailing my hands around, that may make them flinch. So just being aware of those small things and not re-traumatizing is really big. Last thing, engaging with staff. So do recognize how trauma affects everyone, the people that you are working with, and standing by and helping and supporting. They also have experienced some form of trauma. As we see, 67% of adults in their childhood before they were 18 had experienced at least one trauma. So recognizing that the people that we are actually working with have had these experiences as well. So you do want to recognize that in everyone. The last thing is, don't bunch experiences together. Okay, we can't. This is not a cookie cutter way of working, of being, of supporting. Like I said, it has to be tailor fit. So making sure when we're working in those groups, even, that we're still seeing people as individuals, and really trying to create a system or a treatment plan, or whatever that may be, that is specifically for them. So next one.
So I've been seeing a lot of questions in the chat in terms of how do we go about this. We're talking so much about trauma-informed care. We're talking how people are being affected by trauma. So how do we actually create a culture that is trauma-informed? So Rainbow Services, which is a nonprofit organization that is based in California, they went about doing this in their own organization. So in their October 2018 report, From Power Over to Power With, they really outlined how they went about creating this change within their organization. So a couple of things to note about Rainbow Services is that, like I said, they are a nonprofit organization. They were incorporated in 1983, so they have been in existence for a really long time. And they probably have, like so many organizations, have really carried over um, a lot of care that isn't implemented from a trauma-informed way. They address domestic violence within their communities, so women who've experienced domestic violence. And like I said, they're based in California. So between 2006 to 2018, they went about really shifting their system from this power over philosophy. And this script here from one of their staff members, I really liked because it highlights how the organization was before they did this shift. So they said they are a residential worker, and there was a lot of power over philosophies then. So a lot of control over client schedules, what they eat, what was best for them and their kids. And it was hard for the staff as well. It affected the staff members. So they described it as we were the ones who had to deal directly with participants and in a super uncomfortable, demeaning, and demanding way. We had no other choice. This was our job. The management at the time put a lot of pressure on staff. Participants were scared, they were angry, avoided interaction with the staff. And the staff came and went. So you had a high rate of turnover when it comes to the staff. Participants also came and went and weren't getting the supports that they really needed. And no one felt good about the way that they were working or felt very hopeful for the participants' lives being changed in the results. We weren't seeing the successes we worked so hard for. And I don't know about you, but I feel like sometimes this describes so much of the work that I see in organizations, right? So staff are unhappy, the members are unhappy, the staff are having to impose these very stringent policies upon the members. The members are not feeling supported by the staff. The members also afraid of the staff and afraid of going to the staff. And you don't want that in your organization when you're doing service delivery. You don't want your members to feel afraid of coming to the staff with the things that they're going through. So what they did in 2006 to 2018, some of the things they applied were they introduced harm reduction philosophy. So harm reduction, which basically talks about the fact that in order for someone to receive services from them, they don't have to stop using whatever substances that they're using to receive the care, which is implemented in so many organizations, right? So they introduced the harm reduction philosophy. They improved services, particularly for vulnerable groups. So they looked especially at LGBTQ persons, BIPOC persons, and they specifically looked at how can we help these very vulnerable groups and the things that they're experiencing. They revised their guidelines, right? So again, they shifted it from a power over to a power with philosophy. So Nia spoke about so many of the things in terms of metal detectors, having, those kinds of plans, and then really like shifting the environment to create a welcoming environment and shifting the policies with it as well. They also, in terms of the environment, they also implemented something called psychologically informed environment, which really just talks about welcoming. It talks about how do you make sure that within your environment is not re-traumatizing or triggering someone. So the loud metal doors, the appearance of your staff members, are they angry? Are they, are they approaching the members like, we don't really want to be here, we don't want to engage, we're upset all the time. So really shifting all of those things within the environment. And they changed the operations as well for the staff. So if the staff was happy and the staff wanted to do their job, then it made a happy environment. So then the members were happy. So they really shifted their entire way of operating. One of the things, or two of the things I really want to note is that this is still ongoing. So even though this report came out in 2018, at the end of the report, they listed all the things that they still want to do. So they were continuously, and they still are continuously thinking about how do we make this shift. So that says it's not a one-time thing. You don't just implement trauma-informed care, but it's a continuous. We talked earlier about it being deliberate. Like, so it's this continuous, intentional, deliberate act that you keep working with your environment. You keep looking at your policies, you keep looking at your staff, and you try to understand like what else can we do to ensure that our members, our staff really feel safe and feel welcomed in this environment. Um, and they in terms of the consistency of it as well, so it's a consistent practice, right? Again, it's not a one time thing that you do. It's a consistent thoughtful act that you really work through. In terms of, you could go to the next slide, Gaitan.
If I can jump in
Yeah,
really
Nia,
quick,
go.
Kat,
Mhm.
this is exactly where your peer supporters come in. Okay. If you have, I think because of the pandemic and because there has been a need for those warm lines and those friendship lines and those crisis lines to be more of service, even at Project Return, we extended our hours. Okay. So it was a need. So when you have peers working in these agencies and in these centers that you're in, you get the other side of the experience, but you have someone working with you. So it's kind of like a liaison between the two. From your peer staff what the experience is on the other side of the table. And as well, they are now learning what is on your side of the table. So that is really the moment where you bring in your peers and you say, how can we implement these policies and these procedures and these operations? That is the moment where you need your peers. Because I know that, again, because we are not clinicians or things of that nature, peers aren't taken as seriously. So you want to make sure that you see the value of your peer and you understand what they are there to do. And it's really there to be of service to you and to the person, that the consumer or the member or the client. So I just wanted to kind of throw that out there.
Yeah, thank you for that, Nia, and you're right. So I'm seeing we have just a couple more minutes, so I'm just wrapping up with the last slide in terms of what do we do now. So as Nia pointed out earlier, we reframe the language, reframing the language from what's wrong with you to what happened to you. And that is really the first big step that we take. And that shift in that mindset to what happened to you also helps us start thinking about, oh, so what are these solutions I can begin implementing to support you, right? In terms of what's wrong with you, then that places all the blame on the person. And really, that shift is really the first start to this whole process. Some of the other things that we can do is start hiring and listening to diverse perspectives. So if we don't hire and listen to young people, persons in the BIPOC community, persons in the LGBTQ plus community, we're also not realizing how our environments are re-traumatizing these specific groups of people and their specific experiences. So how is your organization relating to LGBTQ plus persons? Are we recognizing persons pronouns? Are we dead naming folks? These are kind of the harm that we can really do, especially when we're not listening to these perspectives and these experiences, right? um, we also want to confront organizational culture and intentionally reshape the organizational culture. And this is a big one, and this could be a difficult one, but it's also a very necessary step, right? So start having conversation. Ask your members, your consumers, your staff, or your team members, what is your organization known for? Is your organization known to be a space where persons don't want to come here? Is your organization known to be a space where persons really don't like interacting with this space, but they're doing it because they have to? What is that culture of your organization in your community, or even as your staff? Like, what is your staff saying about your organization? Do they think that this is an organization where they're continuously overworked and that's all they think about, and this is not a place that they love their job? Have those conversations, and it can be uncomfortable conversations to have without without a doubt. But I think if we want to apply trauma-informed care, again, it's necessary conversations to have. Again, ask your team members their true feelings about your organization. And you can do this by having anonymous surveys, right? Because people may not want to share their true experiences. They may feel like, they may get reprimanded, or they may feel some sort of persecution if they were to actually state their true feelings. So start having anonymous surveys, regular anonymous surveys where you can get feedback from your organization and from your members about how they feel about working there, interacting in this space, and then you can start thinking about solutions. Um, Another great solution is really providing training for your board, for your staff, even for your community. So things like trauma-informed care, right? Things like this webinar, having Guyton, having Nia come on and do those kinds of trainings with your team, to really think about trauma-informed care. Not a lot of people understand the terminology or understand, what trauma is, how trauma impacts, what are the effects. So really start having those trainings would really help. Things as well like peer support. Peer support is this field that talks about, non-hierarchical principles, equally shared power, non-judgments, like having those sorts of trainings that really speak to those things, and helping persons understand the need for implementing these sorts of training within the organization. Um, we can also look at things like emotional CPR. So how do you speak from a heart space? How do you speak from a heart space when you're talking to people and really caring and having compassion for people? Mental health first aid. So if one of your members is in a crisis, how do they engage with that member without causing harm or re-traumatization? Having trainings like honest, open, proud. So you may have members who have difficulty disclosing their mental illness. You may even have staff members who may have difficulty in disclosing their mental health challenges. So having those kinds of trainings with your staff to start having those conversations and making that space a very welcoming space for all persons. You can also do things like nonviolent communication, right? Not everybody know how to communicate in a way that doesn't cause harm or doesn't result in this very explosive environment. So having nonviolent communication training is also a effective method. You can also have things like cultural sensitivity training. Again, we all have different experiences. We all come from different perspectives. And unless sometimes we do that intentional training and that intentional work, we can keep having our differences divide us rather than, us really merging together based off of our differences. Yeah, so we can go ahead to the next slide.
So we don't have time for the poll, I don't think,
No,
but
yeah.
maybe I could do a summary based on the chat and the question. So as a client, I'm going to bounce from client and provider. I've been a client for the better part of 30 years, and I've been a provider for 25 or so. As a client, it's been really common to walk into agencies and be told what to do. It gets reinforced that it's in my best interest many times to lie to providers, because if I'm honest about what I really want, I get denied or refused services. And it's very disempowering. And then I'm told everything I can't do. Like I can't talk loud, I can't pace, I have to sit down, I can't cuss. There's all these disempowering and stripping of power. And for many people, trauma gets manifest in lack of power, as we were describing, and safety. If I don't feel safe to be honest because the system reinforces lying, then it's very difficult for us to be in a therapeutic collaboration. Now, as a provider, what do we do with all this? So I've only worked at one agency that's had security guards. It's not the question of security guards or not as an example. It's really, okay, so how do we create that empowering, rather than rules, an invitation to appreciate the community? How do we invite people that find our systems most difficult to access in and involve people as much as possible? The downside of surveys is I find many agencies actually don't make any changes. So again, it's like you ask my opinion, but then nothing changes. And so one other thing is restrooms. When you go into many agencies, client restrooms are usually pretty dirty, in my experience, while the staff restrooms are pretty clean. There's a huge distinction, and there is a message that gets sent with that. And then one other thing, receptionists and security guards, if they're the first face of the agency, one of the things that's important is actually to train them on these topics, right? To even motivational interviewing or harm reduction. It's asking as an agency, what if someone is very erratic according to our perspective, or and walk through the agencies and ask ourselves, could this, for lack of better words, trigger or exasperate where they're at? Are we bringing people in, or are we screening people out? Do we reinforce lying, or do we reinforce honesty? Do we embrace each person as a powerful, unique individual? We call that meeting people where they are. Do we really meet people where they are? So these are all, it's not a one shoe fits all. There's agencies. The critical part organizational is just for us to consider every little practice or every little system that we can modify to the benefit of welcoming people in. And that would be my simple summary.
That was a great summary. So unfortunately we're over time, so I don't think we have time for questions right now. But if you guys, and if you can just move down to the last slide so that we can get everybody's emails. If you have specific questions for Guyton, for myself, for Nia, our email addresses are there. And you can feel free, well, at least for me, Guyton and Nia, you can speak for yourselves and let me know if persons can reach out. And if you have questions, just let us know, because we definitely want to support you, because we know it's a difficult process to implement trauma-informed care, and we definitely want to help you support that process. Thank
Kat,
you.
one
Yeah.
final thing. Many people are asking if they can receive the PowerPoint. I don't know the answer to that. But my final comment is this: is thank you all for the wonderful work that you do and your compassion and caring nature. Just really thank you.
Thank you so much, guys. And yes, so you will receive a link to the recording of this webinar, and I will include a PDF copy of the PowerPoint as well, since so many of you are asking for it. Thank you for being here.